Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and I am knitting some 1 sock, 2 sock, red sock, blue sock socks. This pattern uses an Afterthought heel. Many knitters prefer Afterthought heels because they allow you to knit your entire sock in the round, either from the top down or from the toe up, and then knit in the heel after the rest of the sock is complete. Today, we're going to examine 3 important aspects of knitting Afterthought heels: the setup, opening up your sock and getting the heel stitches onto your needles, and minimizing the gaps and holes at the side of the sock, because this is a problem that this style of heel is inherently prone to. You're going to need a few things to knit an Afterthought heel. First, a couple yards of smooth waste yarn that's a similar weight and contrasting color to the sock yarn that you're working with. Some dental floss, or you could also use some other sort of smooth, fine string or yarn to use as lifelines, a blunt tapestry needle, and a cable needle or 2. Let's get started. To make things easier later, it's worth putting a little time into your heel setup. I'm at the point where I want to mark my heel placement by knitting across the heel stitches with a piece of waste yarn. But before I do, I'm going to place a lifeline through my heel stitches. Lifelines are great because they safely hold your stitches and keep them from unraveling, even if there's no needle through the stitches. You'll see the benefit to this in the next part of the video. To insert a lifeline, thread your dental floss onto a tapestry needle and then pull it through the heel stitches parallel to your knitting needles. And it can be helpful, if you can, to pull your stitches down onto the cord of your needles, because it gives you a little bit more room to manipulate that tapestry needle through. If you're working on needles that don't have a cord, another alternative is to use a thinner tapestry needle. And continue working across all of the heel stitches, just inserting that lifeline parallel to your knitting needles right through the center of the stitches, and just be careful not to split the yarn in any of the stitches. And work all the way across. After your lifeline is through your heel stitches, it's time to knit across those heel stitches with a piece of waste yarn. And as you're getting started, you don't need to do anything fancy to secure the end of the waste yarn. You can just kind of let the tail hang here down the side of the sock. And as you're knitting across, just be careful not to catch that lifeline in your waste yarn stitches. Knit all the way across the heel stitches. Once you get across, you can just trim the tail, leaving just a couple inches on the side. And again, you don't have to do anything special with this yarn tail. You can just let it hang down to the side. After the waste yarn stitches have been worked, it's time to grab your working yarn again that's still attached at the side of your sock and knit across all of your waste yarn stitches. And finally, insert another lifeline, this time through the heel stitches that you just finished knitting. And just like before, you're just going to go through the center of the stitches parallel to the knitting needle. When your heel setup is complete, you end up with a lifeline through the heel stitches that are before the waist yarn, a row of waist yarn stitches across the heel, and then a lifeline through the row of stitches that are on the other side of the waist yarn stitches. Make sure that your lifelines are long enough that they're not going to accidentally get pulled back through those stitches as you knit the rest of your sock. From this point, you can continue knitting in rounds and finish your knitting your sock. Once your entire sock is complete, it's time to knit your Afterthought heel. But first, the sock needs to be opened up and the heel stitches on either side of the waist yarn need to be placed on needles. Working on a flat, supported surface for this part is highly recommended. First, we'll remove the waist yarn. It doesn't matter which direction you work. Use your knitting needle to very carefully lift one leg at a time to remove those waist yarn stitches. So just use your knitting needle to pull the yarn out of the stitches. And as you're doing this, also be careful that you're not catching your lifelines. You don't want to pull them out. Right now, this is the most important time for your lifelines to be in place. And if your tail starts getting too long, you can just trim it. And it makes it easier to undo those stitches. Again, be careful that you don't cut through your actual sock. And continue across. After the waist yarn is removed, things look a little bit scary because we're not used to seeing big holes in our knitting with stitches just dangling here loose on either side. But you can feel safe knowing that your stitches are held safely on these lifelines. They're not going to unravel unless you start doing something crazy. So now we need to get our knitting needles back through these stitches on either side of the heel that are held on lifelines. So I'm going to start on one side, and I'm just going to use my knitting needle. I'm going parallel to that lifeline through the center of the stitch and getting it back onto my knitting needles. You just want to be careful that you're not twisting any stitches at this point. You're just moving them up onto the needle, parallel to the lifeline. And you may find that these last couple of stitches drop down a little bit. You can just kind of lift your lifeline to pick them back up so that you have room to get your needle through. And all the stitches are through one side. Now we need to do the same thing on the other side of our sock and get our needle through. So I'm going to turn things, grab another knitting needle, and again we'll just go through these stitches that are held on the lifeline, and that first one kind of may drop down a little, but you can grab it there and just go through the center of the stitch parallel to the lifeline so the stitches don't get twisted. And just like before, these last few stitches can be kind of tight, and they tend to want to fall back down into that lower row. So just hold on to your lifeline, and you can use that to kind of pull them back up so you can get them on your needle. After your needles are in place and all the stitches are on your needles, you can go ahead and remove the lifelines, and that's just as easy as pulling one end and the lifeline slides right out, and then pull on the other one and the lifeline slides out, and you are ready to start knitting. Because of their construction, Afterthought heels are naturally prone to holes or gaps on either side of the sock in the first round of stitches, right here and here. There are a number of ways to minimize the problem. The way I'm demonstrating today is very similar to a technique I use to minimize gaps at the underarm of sweaters knit in the round when I'm picking up the sleeve stitches. First, you need to get your knitting needle set up so that you're ready to start knitting in the round. A lot of knitting patterns will have you start your Afterthought heel right here at the center of the bottom of the foot, and that's perfectly fine, but you'll need to shift some stitches around on your needles to get your needle tips right there. I'm actually going to start my rounds at the sides of the sock, so my knitting needles are fine just the way they are. Before I start knitting, I'm going to use my cable needles to pick up and hold 2 stitches on each side in these gaps. One side is very straightforward and easy to see. What you're looking for in this gap is a strand of yarn that comes from one side, goes through a single stitch, and then goes out the other side of the gap. And it's even easier to see here because I am knitting in stripes that are different colors. So this red strand of yarn comes from one side, goes through a single stitch, and then comes out the other side. So that's the strand of yarn I want to focus on. So I'm going to take my cable needle down from front to back through one side, and then up from the back to the front on the other side. And I'll just hold those stitches in place on my cable needle until I'm ready to work them. On the other side, things are a little bit more jumbled, especially because of my color change. You can see I've got some funny stuff happening right here. But again, I'm still ultimately looking for a strand of the yarn that comes from one side of the gap, goes through a single stitch, and then comes out the other side. So I'll go down through that strand from front to back, and then back up from the back to the front. And again, I'll just leave that on my cable needle as we get started. As we knit our first round of the heel, we need to work these held gap stitches together with one stitch that's on our knitting needles, and we want these decreases to slant towards the gap. So my first decrease is going to be a knit 2 together with this gap stitch and the one held on my needle. And to do that, it is going to feel a little bit tight because this first gap stitch and the one on my needle are actually kind of connected to each other. I am going to use my cable needle to just kind of pull that first stitch open a little bit, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to manage the stitch. Looks like it closed up there when I slipped my stitch over. So again, I'll just use my cable needle to kind of loosen things up. And then I can knit those 2 stitches together. And even though it's a little bit cumbersome to get this started, it's ultimately a good thing that those 2 stitches, that it's a little bit tight, because you want that little corner to be tight. And that helps you from getting holes. So I knit those first 2 together, because a knit 2 together is a decrease that slants towards the right, towards that gap. I'm going to leave myself enough of a yarn tail to weave in later, and then I'm going to go ahead and knit to the other side of the sock. When I get to the side of my sock, I need to work that last stitch on my knitting needle together with the first stitch on my cable needle. And I want to work them together as if it was a left slanting decrease. It slants towards the gap. So I'm going to use a slip, slip, knit. So I slip the stitch off my knitting needle knitwise. And that changes the orientation of the stitch, which is perfect. That's what I want to happen. The stitch on my cable, the orientation is already different because of the way I put it on. So I just have to bring it through the stitch that's on my knitting needle. My yarn is a little bit split there because it's overworked because I've filmed this a couple times. And now I'm going to knit those two stitches together through the back loop to make my decrease. And then off the cable needle. So now we'll turn things and go to the other side as we continue knitting in the round. And again, we'll work the stitch that's on the cable needle together with the stitch that is on the knitting needle. This time we'll use a decrease that slants towards the right, a knit two together. And again, things are going to feel tight because this strand that's on the cable needle is actually connected to the stitch that's on my knitting needle. So I'm going to lift that up onto my knitting needle, remove the cable needle, and we may need to manipulate a little bit to kind of loosen things up so we can get through the stitches to knit them together. And then I'll knit two together, which is a decrease that slants towards the right, towards that gap. And then knit across to the other side of the sock and our last remaining gap stitch. Now it's time to finish off the round, and I'll work the last stitch on my knitting needle together with that last stitch on my cable needle as if I were doing a left slanting decrease that goes towards the gap, and that's going to be a slip, slip, knit again. So I'll slip the stitch off of my knitting needle knitwise. That changes the orientation of it. The orientation of the stitch that's on my cable needle is already changed because of the way that I originally lifted it, and then I can knit those two stitches together through the back loop. From this point, it's just a matter of knitting in the round following your pattern for the remainder of the heel. I hope you enjoyed learning some ways to make knitting an afterthought heel easier and neater. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you're ready to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for my 1 sock, 2 sock, red sock, blue sock pattern. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!